114 years ago today, the RMS Titanic sank in the North Atlantic Ocean with the loss of 1,500 lives. Today, we will be discussing the Titanic and how she came to rest 4 kilometres below the surface. The Titanic was conceived at a dinner party between the chairman of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, and the director of the Harland and Wolff shipyard, William Perry. These two men envisioned a trio of ocean liners, larger than anything available to their rivals, the Cunard Line. This idea developed into the Olympic class, 3 full-funnelled liners which would be the largest ever built at the time, with an astounding over 45,000 gross registered tons each. Construction began in 1909, and the first ship of the class, the RMS Olympic, entered into service with the White Star Line in 1911. The Titanic was completed and entered into service the following year. The 2 ships were the largest ever constructed and potentially the most luxurious. With the 3rd ship, the Britannic, planned to enter service in 1914, the White Star Line was now in an excellent position to effectively dominate the transatlantic shipping routes between Britain and America. After some delays caused by the Olympic's collision with the HMS Hawke, the Titanic was finally completed and handed over to the White Star Line in 1912, completing her sea trials on the 2nd of April. Immediately following the conclusion of her sea trials, she sailed down to Southampton, England, to be prepared for her maiden voyage. The process of coaling and provisioning Titanic for the upcoming crossing was completed in time for sailing day, the 10th of April. On that day, 885 crew and 920 passengers boarded the Titanic, and the ship set off from Southampton at midday. Titanic narrowly avoided disaster when the laid-up American Line steamer, the SS New York, broke free of her moorings and was sucked toward Titanic's stern, with only the actions of Titanic's crew and that of a nearby tugboat preventing a collision from occurring. After that brief delay, Titanic sailed on to the French port of Cherbourg, where she was met by 2 tenders, the Traffic and the Nomadic, which is today the last surviving White Star Line ship. From there she sailed on to her final port of call, Queenstown, now known as Cove, Ireland, to take on yet more passengers. With this final stop, Titanic now had 2,200 passengers and crew on board, as she passed Fastnet Light, formally commencing her maiden voyage across the Atlantic. The 12th, 13th and 14th of April were spent sailing through the Atlantic at a smooth 20 knots. This smooth sailing, however, came to a sudden and tragic halt on the 14th of April at 11:40 p.m. At 11:40 p.m, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee spotted an iceberg directly ahead of the Titanic. They notified the bridge, and First Officer William Murdoch ordered the ship be turned hard to starboard to avoid the iceberg. Unfortunately, however, this came too late to prevent the Titanic from receiving a glancing blow, which breached 6 of the Titanic's watertight compartments. A fatal blow. The iceberg pictured here is believed to have been the one to deliver this death blow, which opened up seams between the hull plates for the foremost 6 compartments. Shortly after the collision, Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews, the chief designer of the Titanic, performed a damage inspection, which found flooding in the forward cargo holds, the mail room, and boiler rooms 5 and 6. Andrews quickly came to the conclusion that the Titanic was doomed, and estimated that she had a mere 2 hours left to float. Shortly after midnight, Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats be prepared, and a distress signal be sent out. The Titanic's radio operators set about sending out that signal, using the new code SOS, and managing to notify several ships of their predicament. Passengers and crew were told to assemble on the boat deck. However, word spread slowly, as this occurred long before public address systems were commonplace on ships. Furthermore, the passengers and crew on board Titanic didn't have the hindsight we have today, with many simply not recognising the extent of the danger and being reluctant to leave the warm, comfortable interiors for the dark, cold boat deck. After all, would you step off your big, bright, seemingly safe ship into a small wooden boat that would then be lowered into the pitch-black Atlantic Ocean below, when you weren't sure of anything even being wrong? It's partly for this reason that many of the lifeboats were launched half or less than half full. it didn't exactly help that when Captain Smith gave the order for the lifeboats to be loaded women and children first, that some of the officers, in particular Second Officer Charles Lightoller, interpreted that order as women and children only. Nevertheless, the first lifeboat to be launched, Lifeboat 7, was lowered from the starboard side at approximately 12:40 a.m, with only 28 occupants out of its total capacity of 65. Now, it's commonly known that Titanic did not have enough lifeboats for all passengers on board. However, it was still in keeping with the Board of Trade regulations for the time, which were admittedly severely outdated. In fact, Titanic actually exceeded the required number of boats, 16, with a total of 20 lifeboats. This was also partially because of the philosophy present at the time that the ship itself would serve as its own lifeboat, and that lifeboats would act more so as ferries between the sinking ship and a rescue ship, and would therefore never need to carry all of the ship's occupants at once. This philosophy was seemingly proven with the sinking of the RMS Republic in 1906. More lifeboats likely wouldn't have helped anyway, as Titanic's crew didn't even manage to launch all the lifeboats they had before the ship sank. Anyway, lifeboats began to be launched pretty regularly after Lifeboat 7, which was followed shortly afterwards by Lifeboat 5 at around 12:45 and Lifeboat 6 at around 12:55. As the forward lifeboats were all launched, the crew moved towards the aft lifeboats, and as the danger became more apparent and the situation more panicked, lifeboats began to be launched more full. However, still, only the port side, which was under the command of First Officer Murdoch, and which was allowing men onto the boats, launched any lifeboats at full capacity, those being boats 11, 13 and 15. Speaking of lifeboats 13 and 15, they're the lifeboats pictured here. When 13 was launched, a stream of water from one of Titanic's condensers pushed the boat aft, directly underneath the descending Lifeboat 15. 13 only narrowly escaped being crushed by a few feet before the falls were finally cut and the lifeboat was able to push themselves away. Once the aft boats were all launched, attention returned back to the bow with the lowering of the small cutter lifeboats, Lifeboats 1 and 2, as well as Lifeboat 4, which had encountered issues with its loading due to the forward end of the A-deck promenade being enclosed by glass windows, which had to be opened before the lifeboat could actually be loaded. Once Lifeboat 4 was launched, this just left the 4 collapsible lifeboats. However, in reality, it would be more accurate to say 2 collapsible lifeboats. This was because collapsibles A and B were located on the roof of the officers' quarters, and were therefore not particularly accessible. Collapsible D would therefore become the last lifeboat to be launched from the Titanic at 2:05 a.m. Over 1,500 people remain aboard the ship. With the hope of escape via the lifeboats having seemingly been scuppered, most remaining occupants of the Titanic now ran desperately towards the ever-rising stern. However, there were still 2 lifeboats remaining, collapsibles A and B, which were finally slid down from the roof of the officers' quarters just as water finally reached the bridge. Collapsible B landed upside down and would eventually float off the deck, with some 28 men eventually coming to cling to her upturned hull. Collapsible A, meanwhile, landed upright onto the deck and was loaded with remaining women and children. However, as the great ship finally lurched back onto an even keel, a wave swamped the boat and threw out most of its occupants. Only 15 people would be able to clamber into Collapsible A and survive the night. As the bow submerged, the first of Titanic's towering funnels toppled forward, crushing several people swimming in the water. The stern reared out of the water, still lit up like a ginormous birthday cake. This was because many of the Titanic's engineers and firemen had stayed below to continue generating steam to power the dynamos which generated electricity for the ship. It was due to this immense act of bravery that the evacuation from the Titanic was even possible. However, as the liner entered her final moments, and its very structure itself began to fail, the dynamos finally stopped spinning, and Titanic was plunged into darkness. Scarcely a moment later, the ship's structure finally failed, as she broke in half, with the stern falling down before being pulled back skywards by the still partially attached bow. The stern went almost vertical as it and the 1,500 people clinging to it were dragged down into the pitch-dark sea, with the Titanic finally disappearing from view at precisely 2:20 a.m. on the 15th of April 1912. As the screams of those in the water rang out across the Atlantic, only one lifeboat, Lifeboat 14, under the command of Fifth Officer Lowe, returned to pick up survivors, of which they rescued only 5, one of which passed away shortly afterward. In total, approximately 712 people survived the Titanic disaster, whereas approximately 1,496 died as a result of the sinking, mainly from hypothermia. The survivors in the lifeboats were forced to wait for hours in the cold and darkness, hoping desperately that they would be rescued. And that rescue would eventually come, in the form of the humble Cunard liner, the RMS Carpathia. The Carpathia had entered service with the Cunard line in 1903 as a humble but reliable passenger ship, operating the routes from New York to the Mediterranean. That night, her radio operator, Harold Cottam, just so happened to be attempting to contact the Titanic, just as the Titanic was sending out distress signals. Cottam delivered the message to Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia, who immediately took action, ordering Carpathia to go full steam ahead toward the Titanic's position, and for hot food and blankets to be prepared in anticipation for receiving thousands of survivors. The Carpathia sped through the night, narrowly dodging ice fields and exceeding her certified top speed, which would eventually lead her to arrive on the scene at 4 a.m. She then proceeded to spend the next several hours collecting survivors from the various scattered lifeboats, who were then given hot food, and even had many of the Carpathia's passengers lend their captains to them. The ship was then turned around and proceeded back to New York, where she would arrive on the 18th of April. Her crew would all be highly commended for their efforts, with all of them receiving medals from the survivors, and with Captain Rostron receiving a knighthood and the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honour that the United States Congress can bestow. The immediate reaction to the sinking was one of immense grief and outrage, on both sides of the Atlantic. This was felt no more dearly than in Southampton, where most of Titanic's crew was from, with the city alone losing 549 people to the disaster. In the city of Titanic's construction, the Belfast shipyard workers crowded into churches for special memorial services to the ship and those who perished with her, for whom they felt immense grief and, for some, a feeling of guilt. As soon as the Carpathia docked in New York, the United States Senate began organising an inquiry into the disaster to be chaired by Senator William Smith, who then proceeded to block many Titanic survivors from returning home to England in order to answer questions about the disaster. Once they finally arrived home, they were then summoned before a separate British inquiry. Both inquiries arrived at similar conclusions, condemning the regulations surrounding the numbers of required lifeboats on board ships, and the decision of Titanic's crew to sail at full speed into an ice field. Ultimately, the aftermath of the Titanic disaster brought a number of sweeping changes, including updated regulations requiring there to now be enough lifeboats for all occupants of ships, the formation of an international ice patrol to give proper warning of ice for vessels crossing through the Atlantic, and the enforced uptake of Marconi wireless radios for all vessels. The story of the Titanic would quickly find itself a place in popular culture as a dramatic tale which has been featured in numerous movies, shows and books, with some being produced as briefly after the disaster as mere months after the sinking in 1912. This interest would be stoked further by the discovery of the wreck of the Titanic in 1985 by Dr. Robert Ballard. The wreck lies at a depth of almost 4 kilometres, approximately 325 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, in 2 pieces which lie approximately 600 metres apart. Of the 2 sections, the bow is in significantly better condition, with well-preserved interiors and artefacts compared to the stern, which had suffered implosions and a violent descent to the seafloor which had rendered it a mangled mess of steel. As for the Titanic's sister ships, the Olympic would serve as a troop ship in the First World War, earning her the nickname the Old Reliable, and even managing to sink the German U-boat, the only ocean liner to ever do so. She would continue on as a popular and successful ocean liner until she was sold off for scrap in 1935. The Britannic, meanwhile, would see her entry into service delayed, as she was requisitioned for service as a hospital ship during the war, serving valiantly until she struck a mine and sank on the 21st of November 1916, with the loss of only 30 lives out of the over 1,000 on board, a testament to the safety improvements made in the wake of the Titanic disaster. The Carpathia continued her passenger services with Cunard until the First World War, where she served as a troopship for a while before returning to passenger service, which was when she was then torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat in 1918. As for Titanic survivors, many of them would go on to live long and fruitful lives, with the last of them to pass away being third-class passenger Melvina Dean, who was also the youngest passenger on board at 2 months old, who died at the age of 97 in 2009. Ultimately, the story of the Titanic is one which continues to captivate generation after generation. The world's mightiest ship, dramatically sinking in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on her maiden voyage, has naturally sparked the interest of countless historians, writers, and filmmakers. It is, however, important to remember that it was also a real tragedy, one of the greatest in maritime history, which saw 1,500 lives cut brutally short on the cold, dark morning of the 15th of April, 1912. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions about this topic or any topics that you'd like to see me cover in future, please leave it in the comments down below, and I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye.